Okay. Welcome, everyone, and hello. Welcome to the closing of Willowbrook State School and the brave activism of Elizabeth Hall Lee and Lillian Hall, presented by Jennifer Hall Lee. I'm Celeste Heron. I'm a program support specialist, and I'm thrilled to be your moderator for this breakout session. It's very impactful information that it will be shared today, and we hope that you would share any questions in the chat. First, a few logistics. This session will be recorded and archived on the conference agenda page after the conference for 1 month. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. The interpretation icon is in the same area and will provide access to Spanish translation. We will ensure that the ASL interpreters are spotlighted along with the presentation and the presenter. Please ensure your volume is muted to avoid background distractions while presenters speak. We encourage you to engage with others in the chat, ask any questions in the chat, and when possible, keep your camera on so we can see your faces. With that, Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Celeste, and welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Hall Lee, and I am the daughter of Elizabeth Hall Lee and the granddaughter of Lillian Hall. And this is a story about Willowbrook State School in the early 1970s, which takes place on Staten Island, New York, the fifth borough. Next slide, please. I grew up on Staten Island with my parents and my grandparents, a very large Irish Catholic family. Brian was the fifth child. He was born in 1956. And for 2 weeks, my grandmother did not know he was born with Down syndrome. And in the hospital, there was one moment where the nurses, as she was leaving with my uncle, that they said, "We'd like to see the baby." And she took the baby and walked over to the nurses, and they all had a little gaggle and they talked. And then she brought the baby back to my grandmother, and my grandmother thought it was very odd, but nobody told her. And for 2 weeks, she didn't know until the family doctor came to see her to tell her that Brian had Down syndrome. And they were very upset. My grandfather was very upset. My grandmother could handle it a little bit more, but they really didn't know what to do. They had no education and no medical knowledge. When my mother was very young, around the time she was about 14, my grandfather was crying, and he said, "I went to Willowbrook State School because the family doctor had told them that that's where they needed to put Brian." Willowbrook was an institution for people who had disabilities. And when people with disabilities were born, doctors automatically in those days would say you have to put them in an institution. So we were in walking distance of Willowbrook State School, and my grandfather had gone to tour Willowbrook. And when he came home, he knew he couldn't bring my uncle there. And my mother said, "But if they're going to teach him, why wouldn't you put him there?" And he cried and he said, "I can't put him there. I can't put him there." And when my uncle was born, my grandfather explained to all the siblings that the reason he had Down syndrome, which in those days was called mental retardation, that was the nomenclature. He said it had something to do with the pituitary gland. That's how little people knew, because people who were born with disabilities were immediately put into institutions and really did not get adequate or any medical care. And that's a picture of me and Brian and my grandmother on Staten Island. So Brian was raised at home. Next slide, please. My parents divorced in 1970. My mother was a social worker. My father was a police officer. And my mother decided after the divorce to leave her job in Manhattan, which was at the Bureau of Child Welfare, which was a very buttoned down place. Anywhere you went to see a parent as a social worker for the Bureau of Child Welfare, you had to sign in, sign out. Everyone knew where you were at every single moment. One day I had picked up a little black notebook with loose leaf binder paper in my house. And I started reading, and I thought, this is about a little girl whose parent doesn't want her. And I was 6 and I avidly read this little story. And I thought, is this about me? My mother wrote this. It must be about me. But it wasn't about me because I talked to my mom about it and she said, well, this is my work and you really shouldn't be looking at this notebook. And in my mind at the time, I thought, well, you really shouldn't be leaving that book around, should you? And my mother made up this little story. Later, I found out that she told me that the aunt was going to take the little girl. So, next slide, please. So, my mother got a job at Willowbrook because it was close to home. And Willowbrook is a total institution, which means that you can't willingly go in and out. If you put your child in there and you wanted to see your child, you had to call and make an appointment. They would bring the child from the wards out to like the lobby, and they'd be dressed in the clothes you had sent. There were 6,000 people living at Willowbrook of all types of disabilities. You even had children who were unwanted, who were just placed there. Nobody really questioned things like that. They took the child. That's what a total institution means. And also, what happens deep inside a total institution is there becomes a culture that is formed because you don't have a lot coming from the outside. You're on the inside, almost in a little silo. The first thing my mother said when she walked in was, I shouldn't have come here. But she knew she couldn't just leave. She saw the neglect and the yearning of children who really had never been held, little babies. She was assigned to the baby building. And there was a young woman who was also being hired on the first day my mother was being hired. They also had to have a physical exam that she said to me later was simply gross. And I didn't question that. She's embarrassed, I think. She didn't want to talk about it with me. And the young woman she was with, who was younger than my mom, and my mom was only like 27, was so happy to be working with babies and in the baby building at Willowbrook. And she just kept talking to my mom about the babies. I can't wait to work with the babies and be with the babies. And at the end of my mom's first day, my mom saw the young woman, and the woman looked stricken. I'm going to shift to Brian here and living at home. When my grandmother, who was very religious, had all the kids in Catholic school, right? And Catholic Sunday school when my grandparents went to church. And my grandmother had said to my mother one day, they put the children with disabilities in the basement. And that was the first little political activist inkling that was put into my grandmother at that time. So Brian lived at home. He went to Staten Island Aid, quote, for retarded children. That was the nomenclature. And then he went to PS 22 in a special day class. Next slide, please. My mother knew that so much was wrong at Willowbrook that she met a social worker there named Ira Fisher. And she and Ira figured out that they were going to start organizing the parents because the parents didn't know what was going on with their kids. They had no idea. Or if they did have an inkling, they would just like, there was all these questions. So they decided to organize the parents and they had a picnic to talk with them and to talk to them about their rights as parents. There were also 2 doctors there, Dr. Mike Wilkins and Dr. Bill Bronston. So my mother started talking with them too. So there was this little group of them that they were all talking about the conditions at Willowbrook. This was also a time in New York they were talking about, so it's 1971, remember, they're talking about budget cuts and how it was going to really impact Willowbrook State School, which really did not have enough money. Remember, 6,000 residents. Next slide, please. And these photos are from Dr. Bill Bronston. He took these photos. So my mother and Ira started to figure out where were they going to go. They needed to shine a light on what was happening. See this little cart? This is a picture of 2 little babies in a cart. And these were the carts that were supposed to move people around. But what happened is the babies were just shoved in the cart and left there all day long. So my mother and Ira figured out they got to call someone, they got to go. And so they started visiting people. They went, I think they went to A few places, but one was ACLU. And when they talked to the person at ACLU, she just said, well, we know it's bad, but at Willowbrook, we've heard, but we're doing this and we're doing this. And my mother felt very despondent, like, how are they going to get people to see what was happening? So they went to the Staten Island Advance, which was the local newspaper on Staten Island. And this is an example of the power of the local free press because a young woman who was a reporter there, Jane Curtin, said, yes, I will take this story and I will write a story about Willowbrook. So my mom had her come, my mom and Ira, and there were photos taken and she interviewed. Next slide, please. So as they continued to organize parents, Jane Curtin was working on her um, her article. And there were two articles, one day after another, in November of 1971, and one of them was a headline, Willowbrook Inside the Cages. And it discussed all the cruelty and abuse and the neglect, the lack of food, pushing kids through on a food line and they didn't even have time to eat. And then they were pushed off into another area. There were chokings, death by choking there. Willowbrook was the second largest employer on Staten Island. So when that headline hit everyone's doorstep, because this is back in the 70s, everyone read the same paper. When that headline hit, it was a shock because it was a door opening up into another world that nobody had seen before. Yet, many people worked at Willowbrook. So you got to think about it. There's a society happening inside, then there's the society outside looking in. It's like a window opens onto something that you've never seen before. So people are starting to really see and think and educate themselves. Next slide, please. My mother said to me one day, I want you to come to Willowbrook. I want you to see it. Now, I knew Willowbrook was a bad place and I didn't want to go. And I figured, well, I'm going to get out of this. But it didn't work out that way because my mom was a little bit smarter than I was. And I said to her, well, what if I don't want to go? She says, you have to go and we're going to go. So on the day it happened, the day was a Saturday, and she drove me there and I was in her little Volkswagen Bug and I looked at her and we parked in front of a ward and I said, I'll just sit right here while you go in. And she said, no, you're coming in with me. So we walked in and it was this big like antechamber, like a lobby. This was one ward. And the light was sort of this putrid yellow coming through these institutional windows that had cages on them. And I could hear these bellowing sounds from inside the ward. And my mom looked at me. She put her hand on the doorknob. She held the doorknob, and the doors were huge. And she looked down at me, and I've never seen that look on her face ever. It was a look like you're going to see something shocking. I'm here for you. And maybe I'm not sure I should be doing this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I was 8 years old, maybe nine, maybe nine. She opens the door, and the smell hit me. And I knew what that smell was because I'd smelled it before. And it was in a place that I'd been to a lot, the Staten Island Zoo. It was a smell of fecal matter, urine, and then the sounds of people bouncing off the concrete. And I walked in, and there were all these men sitting on benches. Some were rocking, they were alone. My mom came in with me. She said, I want you to stand right there and not move. And I stood right there and I observed everything. And she talked to one of the men who was sitting on the ground. We were there for about 15 minutes and then we left. And I've never forgotten that image. Next slide, please. My mother one day, so now everything's in the news, remember. It's Willowbrook's on Staten Island. People are sending in letters to the editor. They're all talking about each other. And Staten Island's a small place, even though it's part of New York City. It's like a small town. They only built the bridge in 1962. Before that, it was just kind of rural. And people were shocked at everything. And one day, a security guard came up to my mom at work and he handed her an envelope and she said, what is this? And he said, oh, maybe it's an invitation to a party. And he smiled because Jack Hammond, who was the director of Willowbrook, was getting very agitated about Mike Wilkins, Dr. Bill Bronston, and my mother going to the press. organizing the parents. The parents were calling Willowbrook and saying, I want to see my son, and why haven't you brought my daughter out? And what is she getting educated? And is she getting fed? And what's happening? And my mom opened up the envelope and she was fired. And so was Mike Wilkins on that day. And so she went to her boss and she said, I just got fired. He said, I'm your boss. What do you mean? I didn't fire you. He said, let you talk to Jack Hammond. She goes into Director Jack Hammond's office and he called her an agitator and an outsider. And she said, on the contrary, I'm not an outsider. My mother my brother has Down syndrome. He goes to Staten Island Aid. My parents organize dances for Staten Island Aid, and she's very active with the community for people with disabilities. And he looked shocked because he had her labeled and sized up as a communist. They were still calling people that back then. And he fired her, and she was escorted out, and so was Mike Wilkins. Next slide, please. So Mike Wilkins, he called up Geraldo Rivera, who was a reporter that he knew from Manhattan. And what happened was he said, we just got fired. I think you got to come here and talk with us and let's see what we can do together. So Geraldo Rivera comes to Staten Island. He was an unknown reporter. He says, I'll do what I can, but I'm just a reporter. And Mike Wilkins opened up his pocket and gave him the key to the ward because when Hammond fired him, he didn't take the keys from Dr. Mike Wilkins. So Geraldo had the key and they went onto the grounds of Willowbrook and they started to film. Next slide, please. The Staten Island Defense was continuing its coverage. The parents were calling up Jack Hammond and saying, we want to get in the wards. We want to get in the wards. We are demanding. So now this is throngs of parents. And I remember going to these parents' houses with my mom and listening to them. And so Hammond got so upset because he couldn't handle the activism of the time. He was like very conservative in that way. He couldn't handle what was happening in the 70s in this country, which was people demanding their rights. And he got so angry, he ordered the staff to throw open the ward doors, all of them, and the people rushed in. And one woman yelled out, my son, my son, my son is eating somebody else's feces. She didn't use that word feces. And she fell apart. She was destroyed. And that was the cruelty that was bestowed upon these parents when they started to demand their rights. Next slide, please. That's my mother on the far left of the image. Dr. Mike Wilkins is next to her. In the middle is Malachi McCourt. Malachi McCourt was a radio show host at the time, and his wife at the time, Diana McCourt, had a daughter with disabilities. And she was trying to find a place for her daughter to live. And one of the places she found was Willowbrook prior to this time. And when she went there, there was a doctor there who said, we'll take your daughter, but we can give her better services and a better place to live in if you enroll her in this study. And this study was for hepatitis. And he said to her, everyone gets hepatitis here, so we're just going to give her hepatitis, and then we're going to study the hepatitis. His name was Krugman, and you can look him up. And he did experiments on hepatitis on the children at Willowbrook State School. Now, parents didn't know this, and what I really want to make clear is that parents were lied to. People were taken advantage of. We didn't have the type of knowledge that we have now back then. And my mother was being interviewed by Geraldo Rivera in our apartment. And interviews were everywhere, it seemed. And all of Staten Island was kind of blowing up with Willowbrook State School. And there was a lot of anger by some of the staff towards my mother, and they had to write letters to the editors saying, we're not blaming the staff. The budget cuts are going to make this situation worse. And not only that, my mother was quoted as having said, we need to move towards deinstitutionalization. that this model is not working anymore. Next slide, please. There were protests to reinstate my mother and Mike Wilkins. And my grandmother started to get very active and was writing letters to assemblymen, state senators about what was happening at Willowbrook. And sometimes assemblymen would write back not such nice letters to her saying, well, I've been doing this and that, and people just want to get on the camera and they just want to they just want their name out there. And my grandmother was also working with establishing the occupational training, helping to maneuver the occupational training center for people with disabilities from its infancy to its flourishing. And she was getting very active and writing incredible letters that I have found around my grandmother's house. And I thought, God, she was really something else. And I thought, wow, I'm really glad I inherited this part of her personality. And I was just incredibly impressed. And she never let anything go. She really fought. Next slide, please. Okay, so parent demands. The parents are still demanding. CSEA union is absolutely fighting because of the budget cuts, and they know it's going to really, really hurt them. Krugman is starting to be revealed for the hepatitis experiments, and Diana McCourt joins her husband, Malachi McCourt, in fighting for the rights of all the people at Willowbrook State School. Here is the entrance of Willowbrook State School, and I think people are stopping people from coming in. And those are CSEA people, I believe. And you can see the New York City police officers over there. As a daughter of a police officer, I always have to scope out that. It's just very interesting to me. Next slide, please. Take a look at this photo. And this is important for putting your mind back in time. And this is such a hard thing for us to do, but it's really important because you can sometimes see why people don't say things at the time. We all want to think back in time and we're going to do the right thing, but it's very hard to reach that critical mass when you fight for your rights. This is why people's movements are so important. And I look to movements rather than leaders. Leaders rise and fall. Movements are what make the change. If you look at these photos, people are holding up signs. This one sign says, remember Dachau, remember Belsen, remember Willowbrook. So it's only about 20 years since World War II. What's on people's minds are the concentration camps, and they're making that connection. Next slide, please. Brian's life at the time was very different from Willowbrook, but my grandmother was becoming quite the activist. As my mother was fired, we moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and she got her master's degree and she kind of just walked away. Willowbrook was eventually closed in 1987. You have to remember that there were 6,000 people there. So what had to happen as they were shutting down Willowbrook, which led to the deinstitutionalization of people with disabilities across the nation, which makes this story a historical story. It's in history. Some people who lived at Willowbrook, their parents were dead. Some parents couldn't take care of them. Some people didn't want to, and others they couldn't find. So they had to start moving towards this concept of group homes, which is what we called it back then. And my grandmother was at the forefront of that. Next slide, please. Brian had a bowling team. He loved to bowl. He was on the PS20 day class. Then he went to the Occupational Training Center, which is where they started to train people for work. And my grandmother was relentless in her advocacy because there was a lot of pushback and a lot of anger and a lot of prejudice on Staten Island for group homes. And I remember asking my grandmother, why? And I always asked her these rhetorical questions because I kind of knew the answer. I said, why do you need to have a group home? Why can't, our uncles and aunts take care of him? And she said, because he is a citizen of the United States and he has a right to live wherever he wants to live, and he has a right to live independently. Next slide, please. This is the graduating class of the Occupational Training Center. My grandmother was really speaking. She was the head of the PTA. She was the head of all kinds of events. So she started off with dances, like, doing a dance for kids at Staten Island Aid. And then she moved to organizing for group homes. And she did all kinds of work in helping people with disabilities lead full lives that were high quality lives. And this is a great photo. My Uncle Brian is on the left there, and that's his good friend Ned. And the other two women, I remember one of those women, but they're having their graduation day. Next slide, please. Brian got into the paper a couple of times because my grandmother was in the paper a lot. And this is Brian standing up with the striped shirt at the Occupational Training Center workshop. And he also made pens and he loved his job. He really loved it. And one day he had a stroke at his job making pens. And I believe it was in Brooklyn. They took him to the hospital. My Aunt Patty and my grandmother raced there. My Aunt Patty was also working in public education for people with disabilities. And he looked up at them and he said, I lost my job because the job meant so much to him. And I think he knew that he wasn't going to be able to go back to the job. So my grandmother continued. He stayed living at home. My grandmother continued to work speaking to the Board of Education, the New York City Planning Committee, committee, and working to really keep OTC in good condition. There was a fire which set them back, but she kept fighting for the advocacy. And she spoke to the Board of Education about the rights of disabled people and to make sure that they could go to public school. And she said to them, you have to help them to help themselves. She was very big on independent living, which is a very new concept at this time. So this is about we're talking about 73, 74. IDEA has not passed yet. It is not happening. It's in the works, but it hasn't happened yet. Next slide, please. My grandmother was specifically working on one group home on Staten Island, and my grandmother's very religious. And she had gone to a town hall at the church. The priest was there and all the neighbors were there. And when you're working on a group home, you've got to get the city involved. They want to buy a house. They've got to staff the house. They got to figure out who's going to live in the house. And this was like one of the first houses they were going to establish. But she was really fierce on this particular house, but it wasn't in her neighborhood. It was somewhere else. But the opportunity had arose, and she and her activist friends really fought hard. She sat in the town hall, and all of these people from the neighborhood spoke out against it. They said terrible, prejudiced things. And my grandmother was shocked that people were in a church because she was so religious. And to say, how could you say this about a human being? How could you say this? And she noted that the priest said nothing, and he sat there. And she was so mad. She came home and she wrote a letter to the priest. And she said, you've abdicated your role as a priest. You needed to speak up for people who can't speak for themselves. And she said, I'm shocked at this, and I can't believe you did what you did. And he was so upset about getting that letter. He called her, and she basically said the same thing on the phone to him. She said, you needed to speak from the place that you are trained to speak at, and you've abdicated your role. And after that, she stopped going to church. And I thought that was interesting. And she always prayed at home and continued her work in advocacy. And that's Brian with the Christmas tree. So, next slide. This was a Staten Island Advance article about the group home. And you can see there, Willowbrook's group home remains uncertain. My grandmother's quoted in here. And one of the things she's quoted as saying is that people have prejudiced ideas. They don't understand that this is where we need to go. And some people have even taken to utilizing random acts of violence as far as attacking the home itself, throwing things at it, and I'm not really sure. I've got to look that up. And I remember her talking to me about this particular group home and trying to get it established. And she said to me, I just can't believe what I heard. I can't believe what I heard of people in a church talking about people with disabilities. I was simply shocked. Next slide, please. So Brian stayed at home. until my grandmother developed Parkinson's. And there was a point where she really couldn't take care of him. So one of my uncles, my other uncles, five kids, remember, he was a doctor. And he decided he's going to help Brian get into a group home. My grandmother didn't put Brian in a group home, even though she fought for it. It was just a decision she made. And my uncle talked to us, my uncle Tom, and he said, I think I found a group home. Because with the group homes, because they were established, but you got to apply, you got to get in. It's like you spend a few days, and then, how is it? Did he like it? What do you think? And all this sort of stuff. So it takes time. And he noticed that my grandmother's name was on one of the lists, but she never followed up, probably from back in the early 80s. So he found one, and he had talked to his sisters, right? My aunts, my mom, and said, I think I found a place for Brian. It's really, really good. And we were all happy. This is great. And he loved it. And we're a family of partiers. We really love to party. And they just had parties a lot. And Brian grew up in a very sociable family. So the staff really loved him. And my grandmother in the 90s received an award from the Occupational Training Center, which became the Hungerford School to train people with disabilities. And it was in recognition of her undaunting spirit in providing parent leadership and advocacy and her personal time in helping to establish the programs at the Hungerford School. And when she received this in 1995, people were shocked because the people who received this specific award were usually teachers or administrators. And this was the first person who was a parent. So when my grandmother died in 2006, we were trying to figure out all the information about her life and everything she did. My Uncle Tom said that she pushed Staten Island into the future. And I really love that line. She pushed Staten Island into the future because independent living for people with disabilities was a new concept, and she helped establish it. And we were going through all these newspaper clippings about everything she had done and stuff about Willowbrook because she would go and protest also against Willowbrook. And we realized that that group home that she fought so fiercely for was the home that inadvertently my Uncle Tom had found for Brian. And that was just a coincidence. We really didn't know until we looked at the clippings because we hadn't seen it. And it was just kind of this wonderful ending to her life that she found a home for him, that she fought hard for every person with disabilities to have an independent life with dignity. And the home was called the Peterson House. And my Uncle Brian died just this past March. And we had a funeral for him, and he's buried with his grandparents on Staten Island, and they're all together. And this is my personal story about the women in my family who helped deinstitutionalize America and helped to develop independent living for all people with disabilities. And IDEA was passed in 1975, and we have more to go. Next slide, please. And, I can rest here at the end of this and we can talk about this because I think that that's a good resting place, and we can have a little Q&A here. I'm a Pasadena Unified School Board trustee, and one of my big focuses is full funding of IDEA, which there is a bill out there for that. We also have some funding formula issues here that we're working on, and we can discuss that. We can discuss more things about communities and how people don't understand inclusive practices in communities and ways to explain this to people. And we're really going through a lot right now in Pasadena because we had the Altadena fire. And so a lot of these issues are coming up. And I thank you for listening to me. It's always hard virtually because you're not in front of me. But I hope that you really enjoyed it. And there's more to come on that story because you got a shortened version in a sense. There's more to this, and there's many more images, but I did what I needed to do for this particular organization, and I'm really, really happy I was asked, and I'm happy that you listened and learned something. Thank you.